The Second Amendment says this. It says that a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And I will add that Chief Justice Warren Burger, he was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in the 1970s and 80s, said that the best way to understand that sentence is by beginning it with the word because, as in because a well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
So why did our founders feel the need to pass this amendment, the Second Amendment?
Well, to answer that question, you have to understand the politics of the late 1700s. And there was a huge controversy in the United States about this new proposed constitution with this new proposed government. Under the old Articles of Confederation, the nation's first constitution, there was only one branch of Congress, one branch of the national government, and that was Congress, consisting of a single house. The new Constitution, of course, created three branches of government, two houses of Congress, but most importantly, it gave major new powers to this national government. The Congress under the old Articles of Confederation, for example, did not have the ability to raise a standing army unless war was actually declared, which, if you think about it for a minute, is a terrible idea, especially in the 18th century, and many of the founders knew that very well. And so,
isn't it kind of late to raise an army when war is already happening?
That is exactly right. Precisely, yeah. Especially because in the 18th century, it would have taken many months for the call to go out, for men to be brought into the military service, to be trained, equipped, etc. It was completely untenable, and that was one of the many problems with the old Articles of Confederation, that the Congress under the Articles simply had too few powers, and they didn't have an authoritative power to tax or to raise and fully control the military. Military power was squarely given to Congress, first, to create a standing army, including in time of peace. And secondly, Congress was given full power over militias. And indeed, we used militias heavily to fight the Revolutionary War and eventually in the Revolution. And control over the militias had belonged exclusively to the states under the old Articles of Confederation. But now this power was given to Congress. It's in Article 1, Section 8. And the states were frantic about this because they were losing full control over their militias. And they didn't trust the national government, many of them. There were interstate rivalries. There were actually instances where states lined up their opposing militias against each other along state lines, ready to fight over boundary disputes or other things. So now this power was being taken from them. So the Second Amendment was added to reassure the states that they would still have the power to raise and maintain their own state-based militias. And that was their reassurance that they would not be powerless with respect to state-based militias.
I see you have the growth of this powerful national government, which is completely new at the time to Americans, this new country. And basically the states want some sort of amendment to ensure that they can still have some sort of militia, which is a remnant, which they clearly remember from the War of Independence against Britain. I think I probably know the answer to this question, but I'll ask it anyway. Were there any states that initially opposed it? It seems like all would be for it, right?
There's certainly, well, the amendments went to the states for ratification. There were debates over the amendments, and there were certainly, state leaders who had objections to, parts or some of the amendments added to the Constitution, but there was no systematic objection to it, no. And evidence of the fact that it was adopted. And remember, two of the amendments were not adopted, so it's not as though the states felt they had simply no option. But there was no appreciable systematic opposition to the Second Amendment.
I see. We'll be back after a short break to talk about gun history and landmark gun laws. We'll be right back. Dr. Spitzer, our current gun controversies and crises are deeply rooted in our history, yet we don't seem to have a huge body of scholarship of this history. First, I just want to make sure, do you agree with that assessment, the dearth of scholarship into the history?
Well, it's certainly a topic that has not received inordinate historical research, although among the research that has occurred, going back not just years but decades, much of it I think has been missed or sidelines or given short shrift. That is, studies of America's military history, for example, studies by frontier historians, for example. So if you go back to older scholarship, you can find a lot of information that even now I think does not get its due. But like any area of history, it is certainly one that calls for more research. And it is also an area where substantially more information has become available in recent years, thanks to the digitization of old documents, including many old gun laws. So it's certainly an area where there's much more work to do. I would agree with that.
Why do you think this is the case, that we don't have substantial research into this history?
Well, I think because the history is not all that complicated. I think one of the things that's
not complicated. Interesting.
No,
okay.
I think, well, case in point, the wording of the Second Amendment. Those among those who felt and feel that the Second Amendment should pertain to an individual right, the idea that has been embraced by the Supreme Court since 2008, are those who have argued that, well, no, the Second Amendment is really pretty complicated and it's unclear. And to me, it has been a rhetorical dodge to find a way to introduce uncertainty and doubt about the historical meaning of the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms. And if you examine historical documents and earlier research going back more than, let's say, 30 or 40 years, there is no doubt to speak of or to refer to. It's simply that the Second Amendment referenced concepts and entities that really don't exist or people in the modern era don't understand. I mean, the whole notion of militias. Well, we don't have militias today in the way militias existed back in the 1700s or 1800s. And the historical connection between the old style militias and what today is the National Guard is one that is even now little understood, even though it is a historical connection. I think there has been a concerted effort to some degree to obfuscate in order to create doubt, to open the way for other interpretations of gun rights.
I see. Do you think gun lobbies have anything to do with it, lobbying to cut off research into gun history? Or is that too much of sort of conspiracy theory and assumption on my part?
Well, there undoubtedly has been a concerted effort to stifle any government-funded research on, in particular on the contemporary consequences of gun violence. That's where research efforts and research funding were essentially halted by Congress beginning in 1995 or 96. And that pretty much held true from that time up until about 3 years ago, when Congress, for the first time in many years, reintroduced funding for gun violence research. So that's been the main area where government-funded research has been stifled and where funding has been halted. In terms of more historical work, that it has not really been subject to the same kind of restrictions.
Also, there's always private funding, obviously, to do the research. Not everything is based on government funding, but that's a very interesting point that you're making. You mentioned the Supreme Court, the seminal Supreme Court decision, 2008, which is the Heller decision by the late Justice Scalia. Why was that a pivotal decision? How did that change things? You see it cited everywhere.
Yes, the Heller decision was undoubtedly a landmark decision. It was and controversial from that date to the present, and it was the first time that the Supreme Court had declared that the Second Amendment provided a personal or individual right of an average person to have a gun for self-protection in the home. No federal court had ever issued such a ruling or said that that was what the amendment meant.